Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. There are moments in Imperial history that are not erased but entombed, deliberately forgotten, buried beneath oceans of silence, not for mercy, but for fear. The 74th Penal Fleet is one such specter. Not a single ship returned, not a single soul survived. They jumped, every one of them, into the immaterium on the same day at the same hour and were never seen again. No wreckage, no distress signals, just a gaping wound of absence that chills even the most hardened admirals. What makes this disappearance more than a tragedy is its symmetry, its finality. Entire penal legions, thousands of condemned crew, and a fleet stretched across miles of void, vanished as if plucked from reality. Their records exist in fragments, overwritten or redacted, whispering of a horror too vast to name. What could consume an entire fleet so completely? What could make the Imperium pretend it never existed? This is the story of the 74th Penal Fleet, and the terrible reason why they jumped. Penal fleets are not spoken of with reverence in the Imperium. They are not paraded in triumph or held up as paragons of duty. They are whispered about in mess halls and disowned by naval command. These are not fleets of heroes. They are the last recourse of a merciless bureaucracy, floating purgatories filled with the wretched, the heretical, the insane, and the utterly broken. And yet, they serve. Chained to discipline engines and shock collars, watched over by commissars more executioner than officer, they are thrown into wars where death is not just expected, it is the point. Death, in the eyes of their masters, is penance. The 74th Penal Fleet was one such horror. A drifting constellation of rusting, retrofitted hulks made from whatever was too shameful to scrap and too useful to waste. It was composed of ancient hulls stripped from mothballs, glorified prison barges, and relics from older, darker wars. Each ship was crammed to bursting with the damned. Hive gang lords, failed psychers, traitorous PDF units, even rogue planetary governors whose betrayal had gone just far enough to damn them, but not far enough to require an execution in public. Shackled servitors handled basic operations. Cogitators were patched together with scrap code and archaic tech. There were not bridges but thrones of rust and cracked auspex. The void hung around them like a sentence. But even more than the ships themselves, it was the people who made these fleets monstrous. Imagine a void ship where no one believes they deserve to live, and even fewer believe anyone else deserves it more. Among these inmates, there is no camaraderie, no hope, no loyalty. Only the grim, animal instinct of survival. Mutiny is a daily event. Cannibalism is not unthinkable. Entire decks are left unlit, unguarded, places where the Adeptus Arbites refuse to go. Commissars cycle in quickly and rarely last long. Those who do survive long enough to command these fleets often go mad, their minds corroded by constant threats and the unrelenting pressure of command without trust. Yet somehow, these fleets function. Cruelly, brutally, but they do. They are the Imperium's scalpel of desperation, thrown at orc infestations too deep to cleanse conventionally, chaos warbands too small to warrant Astartes deployment, or fringe rebellions too dangerous to leave unchecked, but too politically sensitive for visible reprisal. And they are deniable. If lost, they are forgotten. If victorious, their glory is claimed by others. They are fuel and blade, not symbol. Within such fleets, a unique ecosystem grows. Prison hierarchies turn into micro-empires. Cults sprout in shadows, not always heretical, sometimes desperate, spiritual, pathetic. Some worship their chains, others, the emperor in twisted, broken hymns. The warp haunts them differently. The Gellar fields are rarely maintained correctly. Psychers go unshackled for weeks. The dreams aboard a penal ship are filled with screaming and light that should not move. The 74th, even by penal fleet standards, was extreme. Its inmate population was composed primarily of multiple failed rebellions, entire regiments sentenced together. Their officers were stripped of rank, but not memory, and they remembered command, even if they no longer held it. This created tension that most penal fleets lacked, the presence of leadership without legitimacy. There were whispered riots on 2 ships before departure. Suppression protocols were severe, involving decompression of entire sections and null rods installed at key junctions to prevent psychic feedback. The Navy crews assigned to oversee these vessels were themselves disgraced. Many were survivors of fleets that had failed or officers under investigation, offered command over the damned as a chance at redemption. But redemption rarely comes to those already bleeding. These men and women were hard, quiet, and carried the scent of the dead. Some wanted to forget. Others hoped to prove themselves one last time. Still others, though none would admit it, believed they belonged here. You cannot look at the 74th Penal Fleet and think of it as simply ships and bodies. It was an idea, a moving crucible of despair so potent that even the warp could taste it. It was fear weaponized, broken loyalty press-ganged into one last service. Some say these fleets cleanse systems. Others believe they damn them. Whatever you believe, understand this. The 74th was a blade too cruel to wield more than once. Its very existence was a crime of necessity. And its disappearance, perhaps, was not a tragedy, but a reckoning. The birth of the 74th Penal Fleet was not a planned event. It was a convergence of failure, desperation, and bureaucratic inertia that solidified into an entity no one wanted to command, yet none could deny was needed. The chain of events that led to its formation began in the decaying spiral of the Ufferman Reclamatory Campaign, a grinding, 3-decade conflict fought against insurgent cults and reborn Xenos remnants in the Lorthak subsector. There, multiple Guard regiments mutinied after being declared strategically non-essential and abandoned during a retreat. Some fought their way out. Others surrendered to Xenos and later reappeared. The Imperium, in its peculiar logic, could not afford to lose so many trained soldiers, but neither could it allow them to return to service unpunished. Thus, these regiments were reassigned not to labor camps or execution blocks, but to something worse: reassignment into penal status and drafted into an unprecedented new fleet. This was the 74th. The first of its ships were drawn from the shipbreaking yards of Euphraxis Prime, where rotting hulks hung in orbit like carrion waiting for mechanical vultures. Vessels that had not ignited their drives in centuries were suddenly reclassified as operational. Adeptus Mechanicus crews, under extreme duress and time constraint, patched these ships with technologies centuries out of date, interspersing sacred rites with growling frustration. Many tech priests considered these vessels unholy fusions of incompatible systems, but they were made to move, and that was enough. The condemned regiments arrived under lock, chain, and gun. Each prisoner was cyber-branded, an archaic and painful ritual that linked their life signs to the Penal Fleet's control core. If they strayed, if they rebelled, if they tried to run, their hearts could be stopped with a signal. Their punishment was baked into the very fabric of their deployment. There was no parole, no chance of release, only a promise: serve until death or die in transit. The leadership chosen to oversee this mess of rust and rage was itself a contradiction. The fleet's command staff was not drawn from high-born nobles or established admirals. Instead, it was cobbled together from naval officers accused of incompetence, cruelty, or political missteps. One had allowed a ship under his command to be taken by Dark Eldar. Another had denied evacuation rights to a noble family during a planetary exodus. A third had stood accused of xenophilia. A death sentence had it been proven. These men and women were given a chance to redeem themselves through command of the unredeemable. Their appointments were not seen as honors, but exiles in all but name. The High Marshal of the 74th, one Galleon Brocht, was himself a figure of whispered infamy. Once a decorated commissar, Brocht had served during the Obsidian Rift Purge, a campaign marred by unnecessary purges and civil massacres. Accused of ordering the execution of entire civilian districts for morale integrity, Brocht had vanished from public record before reappearing years later, newly promoted, at the head of the Penal Fleet. It is said his eyes were never still, that he had developed a nervous tic, or perhaps had begun to hear things in the void. Some claimed his voice had changed. None dared challenge him. The 74th Penal Fleet took shape over 9 months, a hellish gestation of iron, pain, and secrets. Arbite's detachment Omega Vulsa was embedded across its ships to maintain law, and every vessel had at least one sanctioned psyker aboard, ostensibly for astropathic communication, though rumors say they were there for something darker. The fleet's final number was 36 ships, an enormous mass for a penal operation. Not all were warships. Several were modified bulk transports, supply vessels, and even relic craft once used during the Great Crusade. There were whispers that some of these hulls had been lost before, reclaimed only recently from the edges of Mechanicus-held space. Tensions aboard were palpable. Each ship held its own culture of prisoners, some tribal, others militaristic, still others deeply religious. The fusion of these crews was not harmonious. Riots broke out during docking operations. One frigate, the Crimson Shard, suffered a massacre when a former commissar attempted to enforce parade drills aboard a ship of hive scum and chaos convert renegades. No ship was exempt from bloodshed. There was no camaraderie, no brotherhood, just orbiting violence. And yet, as the 74th prepared to launch, something strange settled over the fleet. Officers reported strange dreams, all eerily similar, of a black sun, of screaming voices calling from corridors sealed since construction, of chains rattling in void space. Brost reportedly ordered a fleet-wide rite of cleansing, sacrificing prisoners en masse on the orders of an unknown ecclesiarch. Vox recordings of the ritual were lost. What little remained in naval archives were later deemed heretical and sealed. Still, the fleet launched. There was no fanfare, no recorded moment of honor. Just 36 lights vanishing into the warp, one after another, obedient to orders sealed by High Lords whose names have been erased. The 74th was born in desperation, molded in cruelty, and released like a tormented prayer into the unknown. Those who watched it go did not cheer. They wept. The orders given to the 74th Penal Fleet were clear, clinical, and utterly devoid of mercy. They were to proceed to the Halitus Expanse, a relatively obscure cluster of systems at the edge of Segmentum Obscurus, far beyond the comfort of well-charted routes or reliable warp lanes. Officially, their mission was described as a purge operation, a cleansing of several agri-worlds and minor mining outposts believed to have fallen under the sway of chaos cults and Xenos infiltrators. But there were no specific objectives, no planetary designations, and no expected duration. The command document was stark. Enter. Cleanse. Do not return until the work is done. This was not a deployment, it was a dumping. The Halitus Expanse had long been avoided by most Imperial vessels due to its volatile warp tides and strange gravitational phenomena. The stars there were dimmer, as if reluctant to shine. Warp storms often birthed themselves in hours, only to vanish days later, taking ships with them or returning them altered, husks of their former selves. The region's instability was legendary among rogue traders and Navis Nobilite alike, known for bizarre temporal displacements where hours inside translated to decades outside and vice versa. It was a place used to threaten recalcitrant navigators or punish failed scouts. To send an entire fleet into it, let alone a penal one, was madness. But the Imperium is built on madness and necessity. The truth is, the 74th wasn't sent there to succeed. It was sent to disappear. There were whispers in the Munitorum that the Expanse held more than mere rebellion. An entire explorator fleet of the Adeptus Mechanicus had vanished there centuries prior, leaving behind only half-mad data fragments encoded into astropathic Hathic echoes. One fragment mentioned a false system where suns rotated around empty voids and space bled when touched. Another described singing metal and temples in orbit. But these were deemed apocryphal or the result of corrupted data stacks. Still, the risk was known, and still they were sent. What made this more damning was the sheer lack of support. The 74th was not given supply chains, no patrol fleet accompanied them, no nearby astropathic relay was established for updates. They were given just enough fuel, munitions, and supplies to reach the Expanse and begin operations. But nothing for long-term sustainability. The implication was clear. They were not expected to survive long enough to need resupply. They were a fire-and-forget weapon, aimed at a threat no one wanted to confront directly. The psychers aboard, while officially included for communication and warp navigation, were in fact heavily restricted. Many were under extreme psychic duress, having been harvested from black ships and denied formal Scholastia Psychona training. Their minds were raw, their powers unstable, and yet they were critical to the jump. One classified communique found in a redacted inquisitorial report noted that the fleet would be passing near a node of singularity and required soul-sensitive guidance. This term has no official definition but has been used in past texts associated with warp anomalies of daemonic significance. The jump into the warp was coordinated with disturbing precision. Normally, fleets stagger their entries into the immaterium to reduce turbulence and flux interference. but the 74th was ordered to jump simultaneously. 36 ships tearing into the Veil at once, guided by psychers screaming in unison, lit only by their own fear and a star chart decades out of date. It was a deliberate act of synchronized descent, almost ritualistic. Some surviving notes from the command staff's personal logs, obtained through heavily censored fragments, betray a sense of unease that bordered on supernatural. One entry, believed to be written by High Marshal Brocht himself, read, "They hear us coming. I know it. I dream of rust and bone and something watching behind the stars. This is not a mission. This is a binding." Another, attributed to a disgraced fleet confessor aboard the Lux Mortis, claimed that we are not hunting them. We are being called. The moment of the jump itself was recorded by a single nearby survey vessel, a Navy scout ship on unrelated patrol. Its crew reported seeing the Penal fleet assemble in perfect formation, each ship drifting silently into alignment, as though drawn by strings. No Vox communications were exchanged. No final blessings were given. Just a silent flare of warp breaches, 36 rifts blooming like wounds in space, and then nothing. No echoes, no residual energy trails, no Geller field fluctuations. They were gone, too cleanly, too perfectly. The survey ship's astropath died hours later, bleeding from the eyes, having screamed one phrase repeatedly before perishing. They opened the gate. The mission parameters of the 74th had all the hallmarks of sanctioned abandonment. But there are those within the Ordo Xenos and Ordo Malleus who believe otherwise. Some suggest the 74th was being used as a bait fleet, a tool to test an unknown anomaly, perhaps to gauge the activity of an ancient force long buried, or to seal something that had begun to stir. Penal fleets make perfect scapegoats. They are already condemned. Their destruction is a rounding error. But if the 74th were bait, what was the hook? And what did they awaken when they jumped? The fleet was not just sacrificed, it was offered. And something, whatever it was, took the offering in full. Vox transmissions from the 74th Penal Fleet ceased almost immediately after they entered the warp, and that in itself would not have been unusual. The warp distorts, delays, and often devours communication like a hungering void. But what made this silence terrifying was the static it left behind. The residue of sound, malformed words, and corrupted frequencies that should not have existed. For nearly 3 hours after the fleet jumped, astropaths in neighboring systems, some hundreds of light years away, began receiving fragmented, overlapping, and profoundly disturbing signals. These were not distress calls. They were cries. Utterances not meant for human ears, transmitted in voices that carried the dissonant harmonics of warp echoes. The Emperor's Terror was reported to scream when drawn in the Expanse's direction. Choirs refused to sing, and the transmissions that were recorded, though quickly redacted, survive in fragments among underground inquisitorial archives. One message, identified only by a distorted Vox signature matching the Furnace of Wrath, was transcribed as follows: "They are not stars, they are eyes. He is beneath us. The metal moves, the metal sings." Another, possibly from the cruiser Mortalis Redemptor, stated, We jumped. We did not jump, we are still here, but it is not here." Perhaps the most chilling of all was a garbled scream repeated over and over, echoing through multiple channels with slight variations. "We are feeding it. We are feeding it. We are feeding it." The tech adepts who attempted to analyze these signals reportedly suffered seizures. Some went catatonic. At least one facility on Charybdian Station was quarantined after its cogitator banks began bleeding binary tears. Literal rivulets of data corruption shaped into spiraling patterns, echoing ancient chaos sigils from the dark age of technology. These incidents were never acknowledged publicly. Within a month, all analysis stations involved were reassigned, burned, or lost to structural failure. But not all messages were intercepted by the Imperium's elite. Rogue traders on the edges of Imperial space reported picking up strange Vox whispers as they skirted the Helitis expanse. They described the signals as if someone or something was trying to mimic Imperial code, but kept getting the language wrong. Whole phrases would be repeated in a chant-like rhythm, almost like a child reciting half-remembered prayers. "Through fire, redemption. Through rust, the chains are gone. Through flesh, the machine awakens." It became clear that whatever had taken the 74th was not merely consuming them, it was learning from them. Or perhaps it already knew them. The astropathic network suffered waves of psychic interference for nearly 3 weeks after the fleet vanished. These were not attacks, no ships were harmed. Instead, it was described as a pressure in the soul, a haunting in the warp that made long-distance communication erratic and painful. Choirs reported dreams of walking ships, of corridors that breathed, of being pursued by fleets with screaming prows and hulls stitched with skin. Some inquisitors, against all protocol, attempted direct psychic communion with the source of the transmissions. One of these, Inquisitor Thassaline Vor, recorded a partial experience before her mind fractured. Her final coherent entry read, "It has no name. It is a cathedral of rust. It does not kill. It absorbs. The fleet is not gone. It is dreaming." She later tore out her own eyes and disappeared from her holding cell, leaving only the sound of breathing, not hers. On her final surveillance record, there is one recorded instance of a return signal. A single, perfect Vox transmission sent on a frequency known only to high command within the Naval Office. It originated from deep within the Holidas expanse, exactly 6 months after the 74th's disappearance. The signal was a simple phrase, spoken in High Gothic, with no distortion and no return address. "We see you." After that, all attempts at contact ceased. It was not just silence. It was an absence, the kind of emptiness that feels watched. To this day, the 74th is still listed as active in certain fringe sectors, a clerical error perhaps, or a quiet hint that someone believes they are not truly gone. The Vox logs are sealed under orders that predate the current Lord Commander. And still, every few years, an astropath somewhere dreams of red ships whispering in binary floating over a black sea, carrying the screams of 1,000 sinners into eternity. We did not lose the 74th. We let them in. The Inquisition, by its nature, thrives in shadows, preserving the Imperium not through transparency, but through silence, suppression, and selective destruction. So when the 74th Penal Fleet vanished, it was not with ceremony or public mourning, but with immediate redaction. Entire segments of naval archives were purged within weeks. Orders were retroactively classified. Officers who had signed off on deployment schedules were reassigned or executed. Those who had known of the fleet's destination found themselves silenced. Not through overt threats, but through quiet administrative disappearances, falsified deaths, or unexplained mind wipes. The first official record of the fleet's disappearance was written by a scribe of the Ordo Hereticus named Sidra Malkine, who categorized it as unusual fleet loss 394H. Her report was never published. She vanished before her second draft. The original document, preserved only through forbidden backups now circulated among radical inquisitors, contained a damning line. This was not a loss. It was a sending. The Inquisition's relationship with the penal fleets has always been pragmatic. These fleets serve not only as military tools, but as test beds, instruments of containment, experimentation, and extermination that leave no traceable blame. Many suspect the 74th was the latest in a series of controlled gambits designed to assess or appease an emergent threat beyond standard naval control. The Holidas expanse, after all, has been subject to inquisitorial quarantine before, though such orders were buried under other designations. Entire sectors near its border have experienced unexplained psychic fluctuations, mass insanity, and in one instance, a planet whose population began to speak a new language overnight, one that matched nothing in imperial lexicons, but closely resembled ancient Dark Mechanicum cant. There are at least 3 known Ordo Malleus reports suggesting that the 74th was carrying not just prisoners, but relic cargo. One refers obliquely to artifacts unearthed beneath the asphalt mountains of Carthus Prime, said to emit non-Euclidean gravitational fields. Another speaks of Machina Demonis, an apparent fusion of forbidden technology and latent warp sentience. If these relics were aboard, their purpose is unknown. Some theorize they were being transported to be discarded within the warp, fed to the tides like garbage hurled into the abyss. Others whisper that they were the real reason for the jump. The 74th, not a fleet, but a vessel for carrying these artifacts into an entity or place that demanded them. This is not conjecture for the idle. A senior interrogator of the Ordo Xenos, who had once served aboard an earlier penal fleet, compiled a private report years later in which he claimed, "We do not understand the warp. We appease it. Some among us believe it thinks, hungers, that certain places are not random, but mouths. The 74th may have been thrown to such a mouth, not to silence it, but to keep it fed. What lends disturbing weight to this theory is how the Inquisition moved not only to hide the disappearance, but to suppress the existence of the 74th entirely. Commemorative plaques aboard segmentum command vessels were removed. Archives were overwritten. Even picked captures of the fleet at launch were modified or destroyed. Among the most chilling discoveries is a Void Navigator's chart from before the jump that shows 36 ships in staging orbit. And the same chart post-event, now showing 35. When asked, the Mechanicus responded only, there was no 74th. The depth of this cover-up is best illustrated by the fate of the Medicae log vessel Sanctified Mercy, which was intended to accompany the 74th, but experienced an engine failure days before launch. Left adrift, it never made the warp jump. Its crew, mostly Navy medical officers and low-security servitors, bore witness to the fleet's departure and its aftermath. Internal reports reveal panic, disturbed cogitator logs, and biological scans of the crew showing signs of stress exposure equivalent to demonic proximity. Within a week, the vessel was quarantined. All crew members were executed or sequestered indefinitely. The ship was dismantled and its components scattered across 6 systems. Its name was erased from deployment logs. Only a single data crystal remained, hidden within the memory of a servitor unit that fled into the underhive of Necromunda and was later recovered by a data archaeologist. That crystal contains a visual recording, 36 ships vanishing into the warp, and something else. The footage ends with a bloom of light that does not resemble standard warp breach. It pulses, rhythmic, like a heart. And then, nothing. Why such efforts? Why such absolute denial? Because if the Inquisition knew, even suspected, what the 74th truly encountered or became, then the greatest threat was not that they vanished. The greatest threat was that someone might try to find them, or worse, that they might come back. And the Imperium is nothing if not practiced in ensuring that no one ever asks the questions that demand those answers. Among the prisoners of the 74th Penal Fleet, knowledge was not shared but devoured. Traded like contraband, hoarded like water on a dying world. They came from every edge of the Imperium, broken shards of legions and lives, hive gangers with glow-eyed mutations, failed arbtes turned executioners, heretic guardsmen who had renounced their gods too late, and psychers so raw they could boil rats with a glance. In that crucible of damnation, theory and myth were all they had left, and they had many. Some believed they were going to die. That much was obvious. But death had always stalked them. In penal legions, death was a constant companion, not a destination. What haunted them now was the why. Why here? Why now? Why them? The most common rumor whispered in the dark corners of rusted decks was that the fleet was not going to cleanse a rebellion, but to fulfill a prophecy. A tale, passed down from a mad preacher during the cleansing of Necrosanctine, spoke of a fleet of the damned that would sail into the black and never return, carrying with it the sins of the Imperium so they could be forgotten by history. The condemned clung to it with a kind of sacred nihilism. If they were part of that fleet, then their suffering meant something. Even if they died screaming in a warp storm, they were at least dying for something. Others whispered of a pact, not between humans but between greater powers. That the 74th was a tribute, a long-promised offering made by the Ecclesiarchy or Inquisition to placate something deep within the warp. They imagined a throne of chains, a god not yet born, being fed sinners like meat to a furnace. The thought terrified and comforted in equal measure. Some even began to revere this theoretical being, forming micro-cults of silence and self-mutilation on the lower decks. A few carved symbols into the walls, shapes that didn't belong to any known dialect. Crude, writhing patterns resembling open mouths and linked arms. One story gained terrifying traction. The legend of the Eater of Echoes. Said to be a creature or force that dwelled in places where sounds of the past linger, the Eater of Echoes was believed to devour not just voices, but memories, ships, entire histories. Those who believed in it claimed that the 74th was sent not to battle heretics, but to be consumed, to feed this being so that it would not hunger elsewhere. They spoke of their fleet as already gone, even before they jumped. Among the psychers aboard, who were given neither sanction nor stability, visions multiplied like rot. One recorded himself mumbling for hours in a fugue, speaking in overlapping voices in ancient tongues. What little could be translated spoke of metal that breathes, stars that whisper, and the song that opens doors. Another was reported to have drawn the same star chart over and over, but each time with one system missing. When asked why, she said, "It's already been eaten." She later bit through her own fingers and died in restraint. Some of the condemned guardsmen, veterans of crushed rebellions, believed the fleet was a trap for something else. Not a trap they had set, but one that had been waiting for them. They spoke of dreams where their own ships turned on them, hulls warping, voices changing, orders coming from mouths that looked human, but no longer thought that way. In their bunk speak, they had a term for it: becoming ship-blooded, the moment when flesh stopped fighting and metal took over. A slow, creeping infection of the soul. There were tales, too, of a stolen relic, a black box carried aboard the central command ship, the Wrath Unyielding. No one knew what was in it, only that it radiated cold even through sealed adamantium. Some said it was an old tech device from the Dark Age, recovered from a dead Mechanicus outpost. Others thought it was a shard of a lost Primarch's armor, soaked in cursed history. Whatever it was, the few who claimed to have seen it described a presence, not like a weapon, but like a thing waiting to be born. The prisoners were not fools. Many had served the Imperium long enough to see its rot. Some believed they were on a ghost mission, a final erasure of crimes too great to document. That their deployment orders were not real, that the officers on board weren't even Navy anymore, but something else wearing their skin. The trust that broke down in the earliest days never recovered. Crews formed their own gods, their own rights, their own truths. The Penal fleet fractured in spirit long before it vanished in space. In the lower decks, graffiti appeared, not scrawled by hands, but etched into the walls as if by fire or corrosion. Symbols of binding, glyphs that mirrored pre-imperial void cults. No one claimed them. Everyone feared them. Even in that sea of despair, some held on to bitter faith. Not in the Emperor, not really, but in the idea that maybe, just maybe, the warp would reject them. That the sheer ugliness of their sin, the hollowness of their hope, would make them unpalatable to the monsters that lurked beyond the veil. They were wrong. It is perhaps the cruelest twist in the tale of the 74th Penal Fleet, that one of their own did not make the jump. The medical barge Blessing of Sorrow, retrofitted from a decommissioned pilgrim hauler, suffered a catastrophic systems failure mere minutes before fleet-wide warp translation. What should have been a death sentence, left adrift in real space without escort, became a fateful reprieve. For those aboard, it was salvation laced with horror. The barge had been carrying overflow prisoners, psychically unstable patients, and a cache of medical equipment too ancient to be trusted. The ship's machine spirit, notoriously fickle, had been flagged for maintenance that was never completed. When the synchrony orders were issued, the Blessing's primary warp engine failed to initiate. An auxiliary surge knocked out power on the bridge and burned out the astropathic choir. The last thing its surviving officers saw from the observation blister were 36 ships slipping into warp space in perfect, unnatural unison, like a choreographed vanishing act. Then came the light. It wasn't a warp flare. Those are chaotic, unpredictable, storm-like. This was orderly, a pulse of golden red, symmetrical in form and rhythm. Not emitted from the ships, but from the void itself, as though something on the other side of reality had acknowledged the jump. A greeting, or a thank you. For 3 hours, the Blessing of Sorrow drifted, unable to raise any contact with the rest of the fleet. Their vox was not jammed, it was ignored. Repeated hails across standard and encrypted channels were met with dead space. But slowly, something began to answer. The logs of Medicae General Sylvan Vor, recovered years later by a rogue inquisitor during an unrelated investigation into unsanctioned psyker trafficking, described the phenomenon in vivid detail. The ship hears voices, he wrote. Not us, not human. It knows it has been left behind, and something else is speaking to it. The lights dim when it listens. Patients in stasis began to wake screaming, though their hibernation protocols had not been breached. One low-level astropath, still alive though half-blinded by warp burn, began writing in a script she did not know. The symbols she etched matched pre-heresy Mechanicum dialects used only during arcane rites of machine communion. When asked what she was writing, she replied, "It is building. It needs understanding. We were not enough." The blessing recorded one final visual data burst before its systems were remotely disabled. A wide-angle auspex sweep of the warp breach location revealed something anomalous, a dark silhouette at the center of the dispersion ring. Not a ship, not a natural phenomenon, a shape too vast and too still, a presence that did not radiate energy but drew it in, like gravity, like hunger. Naval Command, upon receiving fragments of this data through backup astropathic echoes, ordered immediate retrieval of the blessing. But they did not approach directly. Instead, a scutum-pattern boarding vessel was dispatched to investigate. What they found was worse than any battlefield. The crew were dead, but not by violence. Most had simply stopped moving, as though their bodies had forgotten how to live. A few had written final messages on the walls in their own blood. Phrases like, "It was not meant for us," and "the metal sings lies." In the Medicae chambers, the stasis units had all been deactivated. The patients were gone, not escaped. Gone. Beds empty, machines intact, no bodies, no biomass remains. The ship's core cogitator, once sealed, was discovered to have been altered. Not hacked, not damaged, altered. Its data logs had been overwritten in places with nonsensical code that, when played as audio, emitted low-frequency chanting. The pitch was inconsistent with human vocal range. One tech priest later commented, off the record, "I think the ship was singing." The blessing of sorrow was deemed irreparably tainted. Instead of scuttling it quietly, a rare decision was made. It was disassembled, part by part, and its components redistributed to 6 different forge worlds for melting and repurposing. This process was carried out under strict Mechanicus ritual supervision, though even they admitted unease at the task. One reported hearing voices coming from disassembled Vox units. Another demanded purification for his own augmetics after a burnt servo began emitting strange clicks that matched the final logs. What truly haunts those who know of the blessing's fate is this: the ship did not simply fail to jump. It was prevented from jumping. Something, perhaps within the fleet, perhaps beyond it, wanted exactly 36 ships. No more, no less. And the one that didn't go? It was left behind not out of mercy, but because it was insufficient. Unworthy of whatever ritual was being enacted. The implication is horrifying, because it means the jump wasn't random. It was an act of precision, a design. And designs, especially in the warp, mean intention. High Marshal Galleon Brocht's name does not appear in any current Imperial records. His commendations, service history, and bloodline certifications have all been erased or sealed under levels of clearance so deep that even most Lords Militant are denied access. But among certain circles, whispered of in inquisitorial war rooms and Mechanicus data vaults, his legacy survives like a stain on a banner no one dares remove. Brocht was born on Sigillum Tertius, a fortress world dedicated to the Scolum Progenium and renowned for producing the most brutal commissars of its generation. He graduated early, not from excellence, but efficiency. A boy who understood orders not as suggestions to be weighed, but as inviolable truths. In his first decade of service, Brocht was awarded 14 distinctions for disciplinary purity, a euphemism used for executions carried out on officers above his own rank. He viewed mercy as a form of sedition, and though he rarely spoke more than needed, his presence chilled even veterans. It was during the Obsidian Rift Purge that his name became a whispered warning. Assigned to root out the last chaos-tainted survivors of a shattered warband, Brocht initiated preemptive sanctification of entire districts. Civilians, untainted but in close proximity, were declared compromised by association and purged. The bodies were left to rot in fields for weeks as a deterrent. Official records blamed psychic miscommunication. Brocht, when questioned, said only, "Fear is more permanent than memory." For these actions, he was both condemned and commended. A censure without consequences, a warning that whispered upward but was never answered. Then he vanished from the records, only to reappear, inexplicably, as the commanding officer of the 74th Penal Fleet. Those who met him in the months before deployment described a man transformed, not physically, though he was paler, thinner, with a gray shadow in his eyes, but in demeanor. He moved like a figure in a dream, answering questions before they were asked, issuing orders that seemed unrelated to current events but always proved necessary days later. He no longer quoted imperial scriptures. Instead, he spoke in fragments, things like, "The eye must not blink and chains rust faster when they remember." At least one subordinate claimed Brocht had been hearing voices through the ship's hull. When pressed, he said, "They are patient. They have been waiting a long time." His final transmission to Segmentum Command before the jump is short, stripped of formalities. It reads, "All vessels aligned, all prisoners secured. We answer not to salvation, but to silence. The fleet is ready, the fleet is willing, the fleet is sufficient." What makes this transmission disturbing is that the phrase, "the fleet is sufficient," is not part of any known naval protocol. It matches no communicative code, no fleet deployment right, and no astropathic formula. In fact, it most closely resembles an old Dark Age expeditionary signifier, a phrase used when entering uncharted regions known to be inhabited by non-human intelligences. To invoke it now was not only out of place, it was heretical. There are theories, of course. Some claim Brocht had been corrupted, not by chaos in its overt forms, but by exposure to something more alien, more insidious. That the artifacts believed to have been loaded aboard the fleet were known to him, perhaps even sought by him. A small sect of Ordo Xenos researchers believe he was part of an unsanctioned experiment, a psychological probe into warp reactive leadership, that his dreams were not hallucinations, but contact. Others suggest he was chosen. A log recovered from a broken cogitator aboard the abandoned Medicae ship Blessing of Sorrow included a corrupted visual of Brocht standing in the observation dome, surrounded by empty chairs. No crew, no officers, just him, speaking aloud to the void. His words, distorted by data decay, end with a single phrase repeated over and over, "Let it begin." What it was remains unknown, but one can speculate. The fleet was his instrument. He wielded it not like a general, but like a priest, preparing a rite that would never be witnessed. If he knew what was to come, and every indication says he did, then the 74th was not his punishment. It was his cathedral. A cathedral built of rusted metal, chained souls, and silence. And like all sacred places, it required a final offering. Himself. They say the warp never gives back what it takes. But for centuries after the 74th Penal Fleet vanished, signals began to bleed through the veil. Flickers of data, ghost pings, spectral echoes of ships long presumed dead. Most were dismissed. The Imperium is flooded with such noise after all. The warp is full of falsehoods, mimics, and illusions, but some returns were impossible to ignore. The first came 17 years after the fleet's disappearance from a backwater astropathic relay on the edge of the Helitis Expanse. A fragment of Imperial Navy protocol, a standard fleet identification ping from the Lux Mortis, one of the 74th's primary escort cruisers. Its signal was perfect. Too perfect. Protocols that should have degraded had not. The ping bore the same cryptographic signature as before deployment, even though such codes should have been cycled out and replaced long ago. It was as if the Lux Mortis had never been gone, or had never existed outside that moment. A destroyer was dispatched. It never returned. Years later, a rogue trader named Hagen Valls brought back picked records of a derelict vessel adrift in the Expanse's outskirts. He claimed it was one of the 74th's prison barges, the Iron Womb, floating lifeless, lights still flickering, Vox systems still operational. But when he tried to board it, his crew reported contradictory timelines. Some said they spent an hour inside, others swore it was 3 days. One said they hadn't entered at all. Their cogitator logs were corrupted, overwritten with files bearing no creation date. What fragments were recovered contained images of corridors that seemed to stretch into impossible angles, and prisoners still alive, staring into camera lenses, unmoving, eyes hollow, as if waiting for something to wake. A year later, Vols was found dead in his quarters. His body mummified in a matter of hours. Scrawled in blood on the walls was one sentence: "I saw the fleet, and it saw me." These are not isolated incidents. The Mechanicus has quietly tracked energy signatures in the Expanse matching those of the Penal Fleet's plasma reactors. Signals that appear, flicker, and vanish, as though the ships exist only partially in real space. Some believe the fleet has become unstuck in time, not lost but repeating, eternally jumping, eternally consumed. Others suggest the ships were altered, not destroyed but transformed into something that mimics imperial vessels while serving another will. In Segmentum Obscurus, an entire asteroid settlement was found razed to the stone, with only one message left behind, engraved into the flesh of a dead astropath. They tried to come back. We burned them. It was not enough. There's also the matter of the mimic ships. For the last century, long-range patrol fleets have reported vessels approaching under Imperial transponder codes. The ships match the silhouettes of those from the 74th, but only from a distance. Upon closer inspection, things go wrong. Hull markings are subtly wrong, asymmetrical, as though grown instead of built. Gun batteries blink as if they are eyes. And then the ships vanish, leaving nothing but static and dreams that last months. The Ordo Malleus believes these are not ships at all, but extensions of something deeper in the warp, grown in the image of the 74th. Like a predator wearing the skin of past prey to lure in the next. There are efforts underway to chart their movements, but they do not move like ships. They move like thoughts. Sudden, non-linear, appearing where they should not, and vanishing when pursued. And there are worse stories. Of psychers speaking in voices that are not their own, recounting ship logs from vessels lost with the fleet. Of children born in warp-scarred regions who dream of cold iron thrones and the taste of bloodless meat. Of a system in the far rim where every Vox channel plays a looped recording of the same voice. A calm, measured voice repeating, "The 74th returns. The 74th returns. The 74th returns." Attempts to follow these echoes have been met with resistance, not from chaos, but from the Imperium itself. Entire kill teams have been dispatched to silence information leaks. Data vaults have been purged. Even inquisitors pursuing these anomalies too fervently have found themselves accused of radicalism, heresy, or simply gone. Why? Because deep down, someone in power suspects the truth. That the 74th did return, or part of it, or something wearing its skin. And if that's true, then what's coming is not a rescue, not a victory, but a warning. One we're too late to heed. One we may not survive. The 74th was not taken. It became something else. The Imperium does not forget its lost fleets, even when it pretends to. While the 74th Penal fleet is publicly buried in redaction and denial, privately, it is a symbol, a chilling marker among the Imperium's countless ghost stories. It stands not alone, but alongside others, other fleets, other disappearances. And when viewed together, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Across the millennia, there have been dozens, perhaps hundreds, of similar vanishings. Expeditions dispatched to uncharted territories, emergency deployments to fringe worlds, retribution fleets sent in haste and silence. Many were never heard from again. Some returned not intact, but as ruins. Ships floating like dead gods, their interiors rotted, their logbooks overwritten with code that defied classification. There is the tale of Battlefleet Draxius, lost during the cleansing of the Maledictus Shoals. 5 capital ships and 20 escorts vanished mid-jump. They were later found on the edge of a dying system, still in formation, but melted into one another, as if their hulls had fused during warp translation. No crew, no records. Just the faint sound of something tapping inside the sealed bridges, echoing as if waiting. Or the gilded armada of Segmentum Tempestus, which set out with great fanfare to respond to a Necron awakening, only to vanish an hour after translation. Not in warp, but in real space. The Mechanicus later detected a residual energy signature in the area that matched no known warp phenomenon. The only clue? A small servitor pod recovered decades later, repeating the same phrase over and over: "We are not first, we are not last, we are just next." Patterns emerge. Certain regions, zones of strange warp activity, stellar anomalies, or pre-imperial ruins, act as nexuses of disappearance. Sometimes the fleets are drawn to them intentionally. Other times they stumble upon them by accident, but they always go silent. What unites these losses is not just their vanishing, but what comes after. Denial, suppression, and erasure. The Inquisition, the Adeptus Mechanicus, even the Ecclesiarchy all seem complicit in this forgetting. Reports are redacted before they're filed. Survivors are silenced. Rituals of sealing and sanctification are performed over data vaults rather than battlefields, as if knowledge itself has become a curse. The 74th is perhaps the most complete of these disappearances, total, seamless, without a single sanctioned return. But it is not the first, and its disappearance seems orchestrated, not a failure, but a fulfillment. The fleet moved in unity, it jumped in ritual, and its traces echo like footsteps through an empty cathedral. Some inquisitors believe these fleets are being taken for a purpose, that something ancient, perhaps predating even the warp's corruption by chaos, is claiming them. An intelligence or hunger that views these deployments not as intrusions, but as offerings, not enemies, but material. There are references in pre-imperial texts to the drifting god, a being or force that lives in the folds between dimensions, feeding not on souls, but on meaning. It eats legacies, remembrances, the stories of fleets, not just the fleets themselves, and that once it consumes a fleet's identity, its banners, its history, its name, it becomes part of its body, part of its song. This aligns disturbingly with the 74th's aftermath. It's not just that they're gone, it's that we are made to forget them, that every signal we receive is a mimic. Every log a distortion, every memory a trap. Why? Because something is learning, not how to destroy us, but how to replace us, slowly, subtly. Already, reports surface of entire planetary defense fleets responding to false distress calls, of reinforcements arriving only to find no war, only silence, of ships bearing correct identification that disintegrate upon contact, leaving behind no debris, only echoes. The 74th's disappearance is not an isolated incident. It is a milestone in a much larger pattern, a tide of forgetting that moves through the stars, and each fleet that vanishes feeds it. Each redaction nourishes it, each silence empowers it. One day it won't need to take our fleets anymore, because it will be our fleets, and we won't even remember they were ever gone. If the 74th Penal Fleet returned, the Imperium would not rejoice. There would be no songs of survival, no grand processions welcoming warriors home. There would be silence, a profound, terrifying silence, the kind that follows when something sacred has been broken beyond recognition. Because if the 74th returns, it will not be as saviors or martyrs, it will be as harbingers. Imagine the stars blinking in and out as 36 ships phase back into real space. Perfectly aligned, their hulls pristine yet somehow wrong, their transponder codes flawless, their exterior markings unblemished, as if they were never gone, as if no time had passed, and yet their vox hails do not match any current dialects. Their prayers are off by a syllable. Their machine spirits speak in dreams, not signals. At first, perhaps the Imperium would embrace them. A miracle, some would say. Proof of the Emperor's mercy. The ecclesiarchy would try to make them symbols of divine endurance. Entire worlds might be named in their honor. But those who touch their hulls too long would dream of rusted eyes. Those who enter their shrines would hear chanting before any voice is raised. Then the symptoms would begin. Tech priests servicing the returned ships would fall into trances, whispering designs not in their memory. Void shields would hum in harmonic frequencies that attract demons, not repel them. Psychers in orbit would scream before their third eye bled. And when asked what they see, their answer would always be the same: we are already inside. Because if the 74th returns, it does not come alone. It brings with it the thing that took it, or worse, the thing it became. And it will not be content with existence. It will want replication, expansion, understanding. The 74th would move through the Imperium like a virus wearing the face of a fleet. It would spread through ports, anchorages, data links. Servitors would begin modifying themselves without orders. Shipboard cogitators would start learning at impossible rates. Liturgies would shift subtly, introducing phrases that didn't exist before, praising entities that never walked Terra. Planets visited by the fleet would begin to change. First in culture, songs humming through ventilation ducts, children sketching ships they've never seen. Then in biology, priests with second hearts, civilians with metal filaments growing beneath their skin, flora that blooms in perfect geometric patterns and sings in binary under moonlight. By the time anyone realizes the 74th should never have returned, it will be too late. Some believe the fleet is not 36 ships anymore, but one entity, a single, vast mind split across multiple bodies, coordinated like fingers of a hand. That its goal is not conquest, but conversion. That its hunger is not for destruction, but for assimilation. Of flesh, of belief, of memory. This is the horror the Inquisition prepares for in silence. Not the return of a rogue element, but the return of ourselves. Altered, twisted, false. Because if the 74th returns and no one notices they've changed, then how many more fleets might already be like them? They found him in the drift, barely alive, his escape pod tumbling through void space just beyond the rim of the Helitis expanse. At first, the Imperial Patrol thought it was nothing. A derelict, a fragment of old wreckage stirred by warp tides. But then the signal pinged, ancient, low-powered, encoded in obsolete fleet protocol, from a ship long thought devoured. The pod's serial number matched that of the Spear of Reclamation, a penal cruiser of the 74th. Inside was a man, thin, ashen, eyes yellowed with malnutrition and exposure. He wore no insignia, no rank, only tattered remnants of a jumpsuit standard among penal personnel, the kind worn by crewmen too low even to be numbered. His hair was white, though his face suggested no more than 40 years, and he kept whispering over and over as they cut him from the cryoshell, "We were never meant to come back." He gave his name as Tellurian. No family name, no regiment, no record of his conscription. At first, the Medicae thought him delusional, trauma victim, survivor of unknown conditions. But when interrogators began asking about the 74th, his answers were too precise. Dates, orders, deck layouts of ships no longer in the records, names of penal officers known only to redacted files, and most damning of all, he knew the jump command. The ritual phrase used only once during the fleet's final translation into the warp. "The fleet is sufficient." When asked how he survived, he would only say, "I was forgotten. That's why I'm still me." Under psycho-scrutiny, he painted a story fragmented by horror. The jump, he said, wasn't into the warp as they knew it, not the wild tides of the immaterium, but something deeper, stiller. A place without time, without movement, where thought itself froze. Where ships became statues and men became whispers. He described a corridor that stretched without end, where doors opened into memories, where prisoners wept not from pain but because they remembered too much, lives not their own, regrets they'd never lived. He spoke of a ship, not any of the 36 but a new one, a vast structure waiting in that place, not made of metal but of language and belief. Its hull was prayer, its engines were silence, and it welcomed the 74th not with fire but with understanding. "It wanted us," Tellurian said, "not our flesh, our stories, our betrayals, our sins." He described how the ships changed, how metal grew soft and then hard again, how decks rearranged, how voices began speaking in the walls, officers vanished, then prisoners. No screams, just absence, as if they had never existed. Entire holds empty in minutes, their contents replaced with humming geometric patterns that pulsed like breathing lungs. One day, he said, the fleet no longer needed a command crew. The ships moved together, pulsing as one, guided not by helm or orders, but by desire. A new purpose had been born within them, and Tellurian, for reasons he could not explain, was not part of it. "I didn't believe," he said. "They did. Even the steel did." He wandered the dead corridors of the Spear of Reclamation alone, watching doors seal forever, lights pulse in impossible rhythms. He heard voices singing in high Gothic, except the grammar was wrong. The tense was missing, as if the fleet no longer believed in future or past. Eventually, he found a pod, a maintenance shell, not meant for long-term survival. He launched it, not in hope, but in protest, and somehow, impossibly, he emerged. When the Inquisition took him for questioning, they tried to erase his memories, but Tellurian had none left to take. They scanned his mind and found echoes, not thoughts, not memories, but designs, circuit patterns in neural form, whole liturgies of data woven into the folds of his synapses. The Mechanicus demanded custody. The Ecclesiarchy demanded execution. The Inquisition chose to observe. Tellurian now sits in a sealed vault, somewhere beneath the surface of Gannis Tertius. He no longer eats, no longer speaks, but every week he scratches new symbols into the walls with his fingernails, patterns that, when transcribed into binary, describe ships. Thousands of them. Some too vast to be real. Others shaped like stars, like thrones, like skulls with eyes that open. We ask ourselves, did he survive? Or is Tellurian the first returned fragment of a fleet that has not yet truly finished its journey? The 74th may still be out there, circling the edge of real space, whispering in frequencies we cannot yet decode. And Tellurian is the echo that escaped, the fragment that slipped the net. A warning. A seed, or perhaps an invitation. How many stories do we tell about brave ships lost to the void, not knowing they came back, and we simply forgot they weren't ours anymore? Perhaps the final message from the fleet still lingers in some encrypted archive, buried beneath layers of denial and fear. And perhaps it reads, "We are home." But home is not where they came from. It is what they are now. If you found this story haunting, if these shadows of the Imperium intrigue you, then subscribe to our channel for more forgotten horrors, forbidden truths, and the mysteries the galaxy prays you never learn. The darkness remembers, will you?